Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to economy. That one sentence shattered the calm of a first-class cabin. He had the ticket, the seat assignment, the right, but not the privilege, not in their eyes. What they didn't know, the man they tried to remove, was the CEO of the very company that built the aircraft they were flying. What happened next? It wasn't loud. It wasn't vengeful. It was precise. 10 minutes later, the entire flight crew was off the job, and the industry was on fire. Who was he? Why didn't he fight back in the moment? And how did his quiet strength ignite a global conversation about race, dignity, and power at 35,000 feet? Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about injustice. It's about the man who refused to be small, even when they made his seat disappear. Like, share, subscribe. And now, let's take flight. The sky outside was pale blue, stretched thin like paper, quiet and unbothered by the tension about to form 35,000 feet beneath it. Ellis Monroe didn't expect trouble. He wasn't a man who sought it. In fact, he'd spent most of his life avoiding it, navigating rooms and industries with the grace of someone who knew his presence alone could be seen as confrontation. At 45, the CEO of Solara Jetworks had learned the value of silence and the danger of assumption. Both could build or break a man. He moved through the jet bridge calmly. No entourage, no flash. Just a deep Navy carry-on bag and the soft scuff of leather soles. Gate agents had barely looked up when he scanned his boarding pass. Seat 1A, first class. The cabin was cool, scented with citrus and luxury. There was quiet music playing, piano notes rising and falling like breath. Ellis stepped into the space with the same calm precision he brought into every boardroom. His suit was tailored charcoal, shirt crisp, tie loosened just enough to suggest humility over bravado. He didn't expect the flight attendant to block his path. "Excuse me," she said, not rudely, but not kindly either. Her name tag read Jillian Mercer. Early 40s, blonde bob, tight bun, white gloves. She had the polished chill of someone who was used to giving orders and rarely being questioned. Ellis offered a polite nod. "Yes." She glanced at his boarding pass, then at him. "I'm afraid this seat has been reassigned," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the front of the cabin. Ellis blinked once, not in confusion, but in the quiet pause of someone deciding whether to push back or simply wait it out. I held out his pass. "It says 1A," he said calmly. Jillian didn't take it. Her eyes didn't move to read it. "There must have been an update," she said. "Please return to your correct seat in economy. We're trying to prepare for boarding." A man behind Ellis gave an impatient sigh. Ellis didn't move. "I'm sorry," he said, "but this is my correct seat. It was assigned through direct booking. First class." The words came gently, not defensively, but Jillian's smile tightened. It wasn't the kind of smile meant to reassure. It was the kind that warned. At that moment, another voice joined in. "Is there a problem?" It came from Brent Delaney, the second flight attendant. 30s, tall, light brown hair, square jaw, the kind of smile you'd trust in an ad, but not in a negotiation. Ellis glanced at him, then back to Jillian. "She says my seat's been reassigned. I showed her my pass." Brent took a quick look at the pass. Something flickered across his expression. Recognition. Maybe, but it disappeared in a blink. "There's been a reshuffle," he said smoothly. "It happens. Sometimes last-minute upgrades. Changes? Nothing personal. Nothing personal." The phrase hit harder than it should have. From the corner of his eye, Ellis noticed a man already seated in 1B leaning over. "You heard them," the man said, voice low and smug. "Move along. You're holding things up." He was late 50s, dressed in an expensive blazer and khakis that still had their press lines. A gold watch gleamed on his wrist. He wore entitlement like a cologne thick, inescapable, and entirely unaware of itself. Ellis turned toward him. "Excuse me." The man shrugged. "I paid extra for this row. Don't make a scene." Jillian stepped forward again. "Sir," she said, more firmly, "please return to economy." Ellis didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. Instead, he reached into his jacket, tapped the small earpiece at his collar, and said softly, "Nora, activate Solara internal flight monitoring. Flight SJ2H7. A quiet voice responded, only audible to him. "Confirmed. Log is live. Internal system engaged." Jillian frowned. Sir Ellis looked at her, still calm, still grounded. "I'll remain in my seat." She exhaled through her nose, then turned to Brent, who stepped aside to allow a man to pass into the cabin. Scott Reynolds, the passenger from 1B, now standing, arms crossed. "I gave her $600 for this upgrade," he said, casually. "She said I'd have the row. Seems pretty clear." Someone near the back of the cabin murmured something. A rustle of whispers moved like wind. A woman, about 50. With silver-streaked curls and glasses, Camilla Rowe raised her phone and tapped the record button. "I'm filming this," she said quietly, but clearly. "This doesn't look right." Jillian turned sharply. "Ma'am, that's against policy." Camilla didn't flinch. "So is what you're doing." Brent leaned in toward Ellis, still trying to wear that polished smile. "We can avoid making this uncomfortable if you just comply." Ellis tilted his head slightly. His jaw tightened just once, the only visible sign of tension. "I complied when I paid for this seat," he said, a few rows behind. Another passenger leaned forward. Arav Desai, early 30s, trim beard, business casual. He looked concerned, but quiet. Ellis remained still. In his mind, he was 15 again. A hotel concierge once told him the lobby is for guests only. He'd nodded then, too stunned to argue. Now he was a guest again in a cabin he owned part of, on a plane from an airline he built from the ground up. The difference. This time, he wasn't leaving quietly. For a moment, no one moved. The air in first class was thick, not with turbulence, but with something heavier disbelief, the kind that fills a room when decorum clashes with dignity, when someone chooses not to back down. Jillian Mercer stood stiff, arms folded tightly across her blazer. Her perfectly tied scarf barely moved as she breathed through her nose. Behind her, Brent Delaney avoided eye contact with everyone except Scott Reynolds, whose smirk was the only thing in first class with any energy left. Scott broke the silence first. "I don't know why we're still talking about this. I paid for this row. She said it was mine. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." He spoke like he was explaining something to a confused waiter, like Ellis was the mistake on the receipt. Ellis didn't respond. He simply adjusted his cufflink. Camilla, still filming, shifted in her seat to face them more directly. "You just said you paid her," she said, tilting her head toward Jillian. "Cash for a seat." Scott raised his hands. "It's not a crime to want a better seat. I do it all the time. You think people get upgrades because they're lucky Brent stepped forward, trying to pivot the attention? Ma'am, recording crew activity is a violation of NOAC." Camilla interrupted. "You know what's a violation. Lying about who belongs where. That's what this is." Ellis still hadn't moved from 1A. His posture remained calm, shoulders relaxed, but his mind was racing, not with panic, but with calculation. He was auditing everything: the tone of Jillian's voice, Brent's subtle smirks, the way Scott had spoken over him like he wasn't even present. And then there was the phrase, "Return to your rightful seat." Not reassigned, not updated, rightful. The implication wasn't subtle. It was sharp. He tapped his earpiece again. "Nora," he said quietly, "I'm still here." She replied instantly. Level 2 log. Begin keyword tagging. Audio and visual. Cross-reference boarding manifest with crew assignments. There was a pause. Understood. We're recording. Tagging underway. Meanwhile, Jillian turned away from Ellis and addressed the rest of the cabin with a rehearsed, almost cheerful tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief delay. We're working to resolve a seating error and appreciate your patience." Murmurs stirred in the rows behind. A man coughed. Someone else shifted, annoyed. Harav Desai leaned toward Camilla and whispered, "I'm checking the airline app. That seat still shows assigned to Ellis Monroe." Camilla whispered back, "Keep that open. Screenshot everything." Brent returned with a printout. He held it like a prop in a magic trick, pinched at the corner and already folded once. "Here we go," he announced. "Passenger manifest update. Seat 1A reassigned to Mr. Reynolds." He looked directly at Camilla and Arav when he said it, trying to reassert authority. Ellis reached out a hand. "May I see that?" Brent hesitated. "Internal document. Yet you just announced it publicly." Brent didn't respond. Instead, he set the paper on the tray table in front of Ellis and stepped back. Ellis glanced at it. The formatting was off. The header font didn't match airline standard, and there was no barcode. Just a name typed in beside a seat number. Forgery. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. Behind them, Lena Park stood frozen near the galley wall. Her hands were clenched at her sides. She had checked Ellis's boarding pass when he first boarded. She remembered it clearly. He was early, polite, quiet. There had been no reassignment. She stepped forward, voice quiet but clear. "I scanned his pass at boarding. It said 1A. It matched the system." Jillian spun on her. "Lena, this doesn't concern you." Lena's eyes darted toward Ellis, then back to her supervisor. "It does now." Brent stepped between them, trying to mediate. "We're just following protocol." Camilla snorted. "Protocol doesn't involve accepting bribes and printing fake documents." Scott shrugged from 1B, arms spread like he just lost interest. "You people are making a big deal out of nothing." "You people," Arav repeated under his breath. Scott heard him and turned. "What, you think I'm the problem?" "No," Arav said, sitting straighter. "I think the system you take advantage of is the problem. And the fact that you don't see it, that's the real issue." Scott rolled his eyes. "You're all reading too much into this." Lena took another step forward. "There's more," she said, her voice shaking just slightly. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened. I've seen reassignments before. Usually subtle, quiet, last minute. They don't get logged." Jillian looked like she'd swallowed something sharp. "That's enough." "No," Ellis said, standing. His voice was calm, steady, unshakable. "She's right. This isn't new. This is just the first time someone pushed back." Everyone looked at him now. Even the passengers who had stayed silent. Even the man in row 4 who had been pretending to sleep. Ellis didn't raise his voice. "This isn't about a seat. This is about perception, about control, about someone deciding without evidence that I didn't belong here." Scott scoffed. Or maybe it's just a simple mix-up. Ellis stared at him. A simple mix-up that required a forged document, a bribe, and a coordinated effort to publicly humiliate me. That kind of mix-up. Jillian's face flushed. We will call security if you don't sit down in your reassigned seat. You can, Ellis said, but make sure they know they'll be meeting with Solara Jetworks legal counsel immediately after. Brent laughed softly. You act like you own the airline. Ellis's smile didn't reach his eyes. I do. A beat of silence passed. Then Camilla gasped. Oh my God. Urav stared at Ellis. Wait. Your Ellis nodded once. I'm Ellis Monroe, founder and CEO of Solara Jetworks. This aircraft, this airline, this crew, this seat all fall under my responsibility. And right now, I am ashamed of what's unfolding in this cabin. Jillian staggered back half a step. Brent looked physically ill. Scott went pale. Lena blinked rapidly, but didn't hide her tears. The cabin had changed. The mood had shifted. No longer a quiet battle between one man and two flight attendants. This had become something much larger. A mirror. And in it, everyone was now forced to look at themselves. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the faint hum of the air system. Even the light instrumental music overhead had gone silent, as if it, too, was holding its breath. Jillian Mercer said nothing. Brent Delaney shifted uncomfortably, his confidence draining through the soles of his polished shoes. Scott Reynolds, suddenly very quiet in seat 1B, folded his arms as if retreating behind a wall of denial. Ellis Monroe remained standing. He wasn't angry, not in the way people usually meant. He wasn't yelling or trembling or flaring with emotion. His anger came in layers, slow and precise, like ice forming across a lake, silent, undeniable, unmoving. I wasn't going to say anything, he said, his voice low but resonant. I was going to let it go. Again, he looked down at the paper still sitting on his tray table, the forged seat reassignment. This isn't about a seat, or an upgrade, or a bribe. This is about something else entirely. He turned toward Jillian. It's about judgment. The kind that wears a uniform and speaks in clipped tones. The kind that assumes before it asks. Jillian's eyes darted to Brent, but he didn't move. You saw me. You didn't see the name. You didn't check the pass. You didn't consider the possibility that I belonged. You made a decision in under 10 seconds, and every choice since then has been a cover-up for that decision. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he turned slightly, facing the other passengers now watching him with wide, silent eyes. I've lived this story before, he said, at 15, when I was pulled aside at a store because someone thought I looked suspicious. At 23, when a hotel manager assumed I was delivering food, not checking in. At 30, when an investor told me I was surprisingly articulate. At 35, when I boarded a first-class flight and was told the same thing I heard today. This seat isn't yours. He looked at Camilla, who had lowered her phone now, hand resting on her lap, expression soft. And I stayed quiet, every time, because I didn't want to make things worse, because I didn't want to give them a reason to prove their assumptions true. His voice cracked ever so slightly. But silence doesn't protect you. It just enables them to do it again and again. From behind. Lena Park took a step closer, her voice faint but firm. I should have said something sooner. Ellis turned to her. You did enough? No, Lena said, louder this time. I watched. I froze. I didn't know what I could do, but I knew what was happening was wrong. Brent finally snapped. Lena, don't make this worse. She glared at him. No. I've followed every rule in this job. I've worked double shifts, learned everything, stayed quiet, watched other passengers be shifted for reasons that didn't make sense. I told myself it wasn't my place. She looked at Ellis. Until now. Jillian turned toward the front of the cabin, desperate to regain control. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, we apologize for this disruption. Don't, said Camilla, rising from her seat. Don't use that word. Jillian blinked. Excuse me. You called him a disruption, Camilla said, gesturing toward Ellis. He wasn't the one who lied. He wasn't the one who took money or falsified a document. More murmurs now. A man from row 5 spoke up. She's right. This was a setup. Scott shifted uncomfortably. You weren't part of this. No, the man said, but I saw enough. Brent's voice came back. Defensive. We're just trying to ensure a peaceful experience for all passengers. Then why does it feel like you only define peace by who's sitting where Arav said, standing beside Camilla now? Lena tapped her phone. I recorded everything, she said, from the moment he boarded, including the reassignment document Jillian tried to hand him, including Scott admitting he paid her, including Brent suggesting they spin a story about him being aggressive. You're bluffing, Brent said, his voice higher now. I'm not, Lena replied. And if you grab for my phone, like I know you're thinking of doing, that'll be another problem you won't be able to explain away. The heat in the cabin was no longer subtle. It was fire, real, burning, collective. Jillian's voice came out tight. Security will meet us at the gate if this passenger doesn't comply. Ellis didn't even blink. Good, he said. Then they'll have an opportunity to escort the correct people off the plane. He tapped his earpiece again. Nora, escalate to level 3. Include live incident feed. Confirmed. Nora replied. Feed is now accessible to Solar Internal Review Team and legal observers. You're being dramatic, Brent said. No, Ellis replied. You're used to people not pushing back. That's what's different. Jillian's face had gone pale. The color drained from her cheeks like ink spilling in water. Who's watching this? She asked. Ellis turned to her. The same people who signed your paycheck. That was when Brent made his mistake. He reached for Lena's phone. Too fast. Too desperate. A reflex. Camilla stepped between them. Don't you dare! Lena didn't move, but her hand tightened on the phone. You just assaulted a crew member. Brent snapped. No, Arav said. She defended herself. Against you. Passengers began rising one by one. Not in chaos, but in solidarity. The tension became structure. A human wall forming around Ellis, around Lena, around truth. Scott Reynolds rose as well, but he didn't speak. His voice had abandoned him. For the first time, he looked unsure, like someone who had counted on being protected by the same assumptions now crumbling. Ellis slowly sat back down in 1A, not defeated, anchored. He looked up at Lena. You did something brave, he said. She looked away, unsure how to absorb the compliment. I didn't do it for credit, she said. I know, he replied. That's what makes it real. He leaned back, folded his hands in his lap. Now, he said quietly, let's finish what they started. Behind him. Jillian reached for the phone in the galley to call the captain, but the cabin was watching her now. And this time, no one would look away. Jillian's hand hovered just above the intercom handset. She looked down at it like it might bite her. For the first time since the confrontation began, her confidence faltered, and her voice, when it finally came, was a whisper to no one in particular. "He's disrupting the flight." She said it so quietly that only Brent heard her. He nodded, grasping at her words like a lifeline. "We'll say he was non-compliant," Brent whispered back. "Aggressive. Just enough to justify it." Behind the curtain, Lena Park stood close enough to hear every syllable. She didn't blink. Instead, she slipped her phone back into her blazer pocket, voice memo still recording. Ellis Monroe sat calmly in 1A, legs crossed, his body composed, but his mind alert. He had heard enough. The memory came back suddenly. 17 years old, senior year. He'd been accepted into an Ivy League summer program, but when he showed up to orientation, one of the coordinators had asked if he was there to deliver food. The insult hadn't stung because of what was said. It stung because of who didn't say anything to stop it. That silence shaped him. So this time, he broke the pattern. He reached again to the slim earpiece tucked just behind his collar. "Nora," he said evenly. "Yes, tag all intercom activity. Capture voice ID attached to flight log SJ287. I want redundancy copies stored in internal cloud and security channels." "Understood. Already running pattern recognition on audio. And Ellis Legal says keep going." "You're covered." He nodded subtly, barely a motion. Across from him, Scott Reynolds was still watching the exchange like a man unsure whether the room had turned against him or not. He looked at Brent, at Jillian, and then back at Ellis, and something flickered across his face. Doubt, not guilt, not regret, just the uncomfortable realization that his usual tactics weren't going to work this time. "You're really going through all this," he muttered. Over a seat, Ellis turned his head just enough to look at him. "No," he said. "I'm going through this because silence hasn't worked." Jillian picked up the intercom. Her hand trembled. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice came overhead, practiced and polished. "We are currently experiencing a short delay due to a non-compliant guest in seat 1A who has refused to relocate to his assigned seating in economy. We appreciate your patience." A gasp rippled through the cabin like a dropped tray. "She's lying," Camilla shouted from row 2. "I've been filming everything. He never refused anything." Brent snapped his head around, voice rising. "Ma'am, sit down." "Don't you dare," Arav said, standing in front of her. "She's not the problem here." From row 5, the man who had earlier spoken up stood again. "We're all witnesses. You try to frame him now, and we'll make sure the FAA gets a copy of this footage before you touch the ground." Jillian's composure broke for a moment. Her cheeks flushed red, not with shame, but with frustration. She wasn't used to losing control. Ellis looked at her calmly. "You said non-compliant," he repeated slowly, "but I never raised my voice. I never left my seat. I never disrespected your title, your role, or your process." She opened her mouth, but he didn't give her a chance. "Your discomfort with my presence is not the same as disruption." That stopped her. He leaned slightly forward, his voice soft, razor sharp. "You escalated this. Not me. I documented it." "That's the difference." Brent made his way back to the galley. This time, David from row 5 followed him discreetly, not confrontational, just listening. "Inside the galley," Brent whispered sharply, "we'll say it was safety. Just get the captain. We'll say he was belligerent. There's no camera back here." David stood just out of sight. He didn't move, but the shock on his face was visible, as he turned back, quietly mouthed to Camilla across the cabin. "They're lying. I heard everything." Lena stepped forward again, more confident now. "Enough," she said. "I'm a trained flight operations intern. I reviewed his boarding pass myself. I was assigned to welcome passengers in first class. His seat was 1A, and I have the logs to prove it." Jillian turned on her, fury rising. "You are out of line." "No," Lena said, her voice unwavering. "You are, and you've been reported before." The words dropped like a stone in still water. What Brent asked quickly. Turning, "There are internal complaints about you," Lena said to Jillian. "I reviewed them during my onboarding. They never made it past mid-management." Murmurs rose again. Someone whispered in row 3, "I knew it. This isn't the first time." Another woman leaned to her seatmate. Always the same type of passenger, too. Ellis sat back, hands folded together. He wasn't proud. He wasn't even satisfied. He was focused. The storm was unfolding, but he wasn't just weathering it. He was charting it. Jillian's voice rose, trembling now. "You're accusing me of discrimination. That's ridiculous." Camilla stood again. "You tried to move him from a seat he paid for. You forged a reassignment log. You publicly humiliated him. And now you're doubling down because you got caught." Scott muttered under his breath. "This is a circus." "Say that louder," Arav said, crossing his arms. "Say it so we can all hear what you think about what's happening here." Scott went quiet. David returned from the galley, face pale. He walked straight up the aisle and addressed the cabin. "I heard them," he said. "They were planning what to say in the galley, how to spin this. This was a coordinated effort." That was it, the tipping point. Voices from all over the cabin began to rise. Some supportive, some angry, all clear. "Let him stay. This is wrong. He deserves better than this." Jillian turned to Brent, panic in her eyes. "What do we do?" Brent didn't answer. He looked like he was searching for an exit that didn't exist. Lena stepped forward once more. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "with your permission, I'd like to report this incident directly to Solara's ethics and compliance line. On record. As crew." Ellis looked at her, for a moment seeing not just a young woman in uniform, but the future. "You don't need my permission," he said, "but you have my support." Jillian reached out, perhaps without thinking, to grab Lena's shoulder. But Ellis stood, one step forward. No noise, no grand movement. He looked her in the eye and said with devastating calm, "Touch her again, and you will be removed in handcuffs. You don't understand the full extent of what you've set in motion." Brent finally spoke. "You're threatening a flight attendant now. That's a federal offense." Ellis turned to him. "What you've done is a federal offense. Falsifying documentation, accepting bribes, attempting to remove a valid passenger based on race. You did it loudly. You did it arrogantly. And you did it in front of 24 witnesses." He looked around, and every single person in this cabin is now part of the record. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, purposeful, measured. Because in that moment, for the first time since he had boarded the plane, the weight of Ellis Monroe's presence became clear. He wasn't just sitting in seat 1A anymore. He had just taken command of the entire cabin. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with peace. It was the silence before something cracked. The moment when everything stood still because it had nowhere else left to go. Ellis Monroe remained on his feet in front of seat 1A, eyes level, hands calm at his sides. Around him, the cabin had shifted. No longer a quiet, detached space full of privilege and pretense, but something more raw, real, witnessed. Jillian Mercer hadn't moved since Ellis's warning. Her outstretched hand hung awkwardly in midair for a few seconds before she let it fall back to her side. Brent Delaney, for all his smugness earlier, stood behind her now like a man realizing the trap he'd set was springing on himself. And in the corner of first class, near the galley wall, Lena Park took a deep breath and stepped forward again. "This needs to stop," she said, her voice steady this time. "You're trying to control a narrative that doesn't exist. There was no aggression, no noncompliance, no disturbance, just a man in his seat." Jillian turned, her expression cracking under the pressure. "You're speaking out against crew authority. I'm speaking out for the truth," Lena replied. "There's a difference." Camilla stood again, nodding. "She's right," she said. "You didn't expect us to notice. You thought we'd just look away like people usually do." More passengers were sitting upright now, listening, engaged. Some had phones out. Others just had their eyes locked on Jillian and Brent. The energy in the room had shifted, and there was no turning it back. Brent's voice was strained when he spoke. "We're trying to de-escalate this for the safety and comfort of everyone on board." Ellis raised an eyebrow. "You escalated it the moment you accepted money and printed a false manifest." Jillian flinched. Scott Reynolds, still in 1B, muttered, "This is ridiculous. Just let it go. Everyone's too sensitive these days." "You bribed your way into this seat," Arav Desai shot back. "And now you're lecturing people about being sensitive." Scott waved him off. "I paid for comfort. That's not a crime. But how you paid for it is," David said from further back. "You enabled this." Scott leaned back and said nothing. Ellis slowly sat again, not in defeat, but in control. His presence didn't shrink. It settled like a judge returning to the bench. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, his voice carrying without needing to rise. "If you put your hands on me again, if you falsify another document, if you so much as touch another passenger in this cabin without cause, I will shut this flight down from my phone before we leave the runway." Jillian scoffed. "You're bluffing? Are you sure about that?" Ellis asked. He tapped his earpiece again. "Nora," he said, still watching Jillian. "Status?" Nora's voice came through calmly, audible now to a few of the closer passengers. "Audio logs are live. Incident report filed. Compliance team watching in real time. Board Executive Renee Dalton is on standby." Board Jillian whispered. "What board?" Brent looked suddenly nauseous. "I told you," Ellis said, his voice like smooth steel. "This wasn't just about a seat. This is about a pattern, one I've ignored for too long. But not today." Lena stepped beside him now, shoulder squared. She looked at Jillian, then Brent. "You told me during training that first class has a look. I didn't question it then. I do now." "Lena." "Stop," Brent snapped. "You said certain people don't match the brand," she continued. "You told me if I saw someone who didn't fit, I should quietly report it to you. You called it a soft flag." Brent turned red. "That's not what It's exactly what you said," she interrupted. "And now we're here." Jillian looked as if she wanted to disappear. Her posture collapsed slightly, her voice brittle. "We were just following protocols." David stepped up the aisle, his tone incredulous. "Is there a written protocol that says to accept cash bribes and kick people out of their rightful seats?" "You don't understand," Brent said quickly. "Sometimes we get pressured. We're told to make the cabin look right, to maintain the image. Ellis leaned forward in his seat. Define, look right. Brent didn't answer. A young man from row 4 stood now. He had said nothing until this point, but his voice came out clear, like someone who had waited a long time to speak. I've flown Solara 8 times in the last year. My wife is Nigerian. Every time she's with me, there's an issue, boarding delays, seat changes. We never say anything. But this proves it wasn't random. Ellis nodded, absorbing the words. Thank you. More voices joined in. I was bumped from first once, said a woman in row 6. No explanation. I just assumed it was a mistake. I travel for work, said a man near the back. Black, dressed in a suit. Still get second looks. Every time. Like I wandered into the wrong section. The cabin had become a courtroom, and the testimony kept pouring in. Jillian's hands were trembling. She reached again for the intercom. Her instincts told her to regain control. Ellis stood once more, shaking his head slowly. You've said enough. She froze. He turned to Lena. Report is already filed, she said. Ethics team has your statement, mine, and the passenger witness files. I've sent everything to the secure portal. Time-stamped, verified. Ellis looked to the passengers. If there's anyone else who wants to submit a statement, it will be reviewed directly by our internal accountability office. Camilla raised her hand, still holding her phone. I already uploaded my video. Arav nodded. I've got screenshots of the app showing seat assignments. Timestamp before takeoff, David added. I've documented their conversation in the galley, word for word. Ellis closed his eyes for a moment. He could feel the weight of all of it. The years, the assumptions, the casual cruelty wrapped in professional language, the way it was always justified with a smirk and a shrug. He remembered being a boy watching his father ask for basic respect, only to be treated like an inconvenience. He remembered standing in a hotel lobby as a grown man and being asked who he was waiting for. He remembered staying quiet, always staying quiet, but not now, not anymore. He opened his eyes and said to the cabin, "This ends today," and the passengers nodded, not out of obligation, out of truth. Brent Delaney had gone pale, not the kind of pale that comes from illness, but the kind that rushes in when the body realizes it's run out of cover. The cabin felt tighter now, not physically, but emotionally. Everything had shifted. First class wasn't a status symbol anymore. It was a stage. And every person sitting in those wide, cushioned seats had now become a witness. Jillian Mercer stood next to Brent, her arms stiff, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The smirk she wore at the beginning of boarding had completely vanished. In its place was something closer to fear, though she'd never admit it. Not yet. Scott Reynolds tried to pretend it wasn't happening. He kept his eyes fixed on the bulkhead in front of him, jaw tight, arms folded, hoping this would all dissolve if he just stayed still long enough. It didn't. Ellis Monroe was still standing in the aisle, posture relaxed, voice composed. But there was a weight behind his words now, a quiet, deliberate pressure that everyone could feel. You said you were just following protocol, Ellis said to Jillian. She didn't respond. I'd like you to define that protocol for me, in front of everyone. Brent stepped in. There are things we're trained to notice, he said, trying to control his tone, behavior, appearance, passenger risk. We're trained to flag irregularities. Arav raised an eyebrow. And Ellis Monroe, sitting in seat 1A, looked like a risk to you. Brent swallowed hard. It's not personal. Camilla stood again. It was the moment you took money to bump him out of a seat he paid for. Brent waved a hand. Look, it happens more often than you think. Upgrades, priority seating, last-minute reassignments. Most people don't even notice. They notice when it keeps happening to the same type of people, said a woman further down the row, her voice low but sharp. Lena Park took another step into the aisle, her phone still held close to her body, camera angled downward but recording. There are patterns, she said, and you knew it. I've seen it too. I didn't want to believe it at first, but after this there's no doubt. Ellis turned toward Lena, then back to Brent. You called me aggressive? Brent's mouth opened, then shut. You whispered it in the galley. Told Jillian to say I was escalating, that it would be your word against mine. I didn't mean it like that. Yes, you did, Ellis said, voice low. Say it again. Brent hesitated. Around him, the cabin was silent. Say it. Brent didn't speak, but the damage had already been done. Ellis let out a slow breath and sat back down in 1A, not to yield, but to recenter. He'd stood enough for now. The weight of what was unfolding didn't need more volume. It needed clarity. Lena looked toward him. He nodded once, giving her quiet permission. She turned back to the crew. This isn't about one passenger, she said. It's about how you've treated passengers who don't fit your silent checklist. You never write it down, but it's there. I've seen you look at boarding manifests and make assumptions based on names. I've heard the jokes about row 5 being safer and first class looking premium. You think that isn't noticed? Jillian took a step toward her. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, Lena said. I'm showing proportion, because if you can do this to him, a man with every right to sit in that seat, then what else have you done to the ones without power to fight back? Jillian's voice cracked. I didn't know who he was. And there it was. The real truth. Ellis raised his head slightly. That's the part that stays with me, he said. You thought you could get away with it because you didn't know who I was. Not because you thought you were right, but because you assumed no one would stop you. David from row 5 stood again. I overheard them in the galley, he said clearly. They were rehearsing a story. Planning how to paint him as disruptive, Camilla added. I filmed almost everything. Even Brent trying to snatch Lena's phone. A passenger from the back raised his voice. I've got audio. From before takeoff. Voices were gathering like a storm. Then, suddenly, the cockpit door opened. Out stepped Captain Ray Holloway. Tall, gray-haired, with a face carved by wind and time. He wore his uniform neatly, silver stripes catching the light as he walked into the center of the tension. His eyes scanned the cabin. Then they locked onto Ellis, and recognition flickered. Mr. Monroe, he said with a nod. Ellis stood. Captain. The entire cabin waited. I just received word from Solara headquarters, Holloway said. Executive Command has activated live monitoring of this flight. I was told you've authorized a Level 4 protocol escalation. Is that correct? Ellis nodded once. It is. The captain took a breath. Steady and calm. I've reviewed the footage from our internal cabin surveillance system, he said, and the incident log that's been uploaded in real time. Based on what I've seen and heard, I will be removing 2 members of this crew prior to takeoff. Gas rang out. Even Scott Reynolds sat up straighter. Brent stepped forward. Captain, we were trying to maintain order. He was. The captain raised his hand to silence him. Mr. Delaney, you will speak when I ask you to. For now, you are to return to the galley and await further instruction. Brent looked like he wanted to object, but thought better of it. He turned and disappeared behind the curtain. Captain Holloway turned to Jillian. "I've served 28 years in this role," he said quietly. "I've flown through war zones, weathered hurricanes, and handled every kind of crisis in the sky. But what you did here today, it violates everything this uniform stands for." Jillian's lips trembled. "No," he said, with a finality that silenced her. "You don't speak now." She slowly backed away, retreating toward the galley like a shadow dissolving in light. The captain turned to Lena. "Are you safe to continue this flight?" "Ms." Parklina nodded, stunned. "Yes, sir." He looked at the rest of the passengers. "We will be delayed 20 minutes while the crew change is finalized. Solara Security will meet us at the gate." No one complained. In fact, many began to clap. Not loud or theatrical, just steady. Real. Ellis sat back down, his face unreadable. The truth had spoken, and for once, the sky would have to wait. The applause faded into a thick, reverent quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded more explanation. It was the kind that came when everyone in the room knew finally that the truth had taken the microphone. Captain Ray Holloway gave a small nod to the passengers, then turned and stepped quietly back through the galley curtain. The click of the cockpit door echoed faintly, like a period at the end of a long and overdue sentence. Ellis Monroe sat perfectly still in seat 1A. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply breathed. Deep. Full. For the first time since boarding, it was a breath that didn't have to make room for suppression. The passengers began settling back in, but their gazes remained fixed on him. People who hadn't spoken earlier now looked with something closer to awe. But Ellis didn't seek attention. He never had. What he sought was clarity. And in that moment, the air was clearer than it had been all flight. Across the aisle. Lena Parks stood with her arms crossed, not in defiance, but in certainty. Her phone was still in her pocket, but she no longer needed to hold it like a shield. Truth had already been exposed. Scott Reynolds remained seated in 1B, shoulders hunched, hands wringing in his lap. He didn't look at Ellis. He didn't speak. He just sat there, his earlier arrogance having dissolved into something far more familiar shame. Jillian Mercer and Brent Delaney hadn't returned to the cabin, and they wouldn't. Ellis knew that. The door to the jet bridge had closed, but security was waiting. Somewhere behind the scenes, papers were being prepared, flight logs were being reviewed, internal systems were already moving like clockwork. Still, a question hung heavy in the air, unspoken. Who is he? Camilla Rowe, seated now but leaning forward slightly, was the first to say it out loud. "Mr. Monroe. Forgive me if this is too forward, but who exactly are you?" Ellis looked at her, and for a second, the corners of his mouth lifted, just slightly. Not a smirk, not a performance, just a signal that it was time. "I'm Ellis Monroe," he said calmly, without flourish, founder and chief executive officer of Solara Jetworks. The words moved like thunder wrapped in silk. Camilla's mouth opened slightly. Arav's eyes widened. David from row 5 leaned forward so quickly his glasses almost slid off. Scott let out a sound half scoff, half choked. No way," he said. Ellis turned his head to him, expression steady. "You were about to say something." Scott shook his head. You could have said that from the beginning." "I could have," Ellis agreed. "But that's the problem, isn't it? The only thing that stopped you wasn't the truth. It was the power behind it." Scott didn't respond. "Had I been anyone else," Ellis continued, "someone without a title, Without leverage, you would have succeeded. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed clean. You would have taken the seat. Jillian would have filed her version of events. Brent would have supported it. I would have been removed, labeled a problem passenger, and everyone else on this flight would have moved on, Camilla whispered. But not this time. Ellis nodded once. Not this time. He looked at Lena. And not alone. Lena straightened, something in her eyes lighting recognition, responsibility, maybe pride. For the first time, she stood not as a trainee, not as someone unsure of her place, but as someone who had claimed it. A young woman in row 4 raised her voice softly. If you don't mind me asking, why didn't you just tell them who you were right away? Ellis didn't answer at first. He turned, looked out the window beside him. The tarmac was still. Planes blinked in the distance. Luggage carts moved slowly, unaware of the revolution happening inside one aircraft. I spent years trying to prove I belonged, he said quietly. In rooms, in board meetings, in golf clubs, in lounges. I thought maybe if I dressed right, spoke right, worked twice as hard, it would be enough. He turned back to the cabin, but at some point I realized I didn't want to be accepted because of what I could do. I wanted to be accepted because of who I am. He took another breath, and who I am should never depend on whether or not someone else knows my title. The woman in row 4 nodded slowly. Camilla wiped at the corner of her eye. Subtle and quick. David muttered, Damn. Ellis continued, This wasn't just about today. It was about everything that came before it. Every accidental downgrade. Every extra screening. Every dismissive glance. Every time someone assumed they had more right to comfort, to dignity, to space simply because of how they looked. He looked at Scott again. And every time someone paid to erase someone else. Scott finally found his voice again, though it was low and defensive. I didn't know. I didn't think they'd take it that far. You didn't ask, Ellis replied. You didn't care what the cost was. Because to you, my seat was negotiable, but yours never was. Arav stood, turning toward Scott. You paid to steal space. That's what this is. And the fact that you still think you're the victim, that says everything. Scott looked away. Ellis turned to Lena. Have you spoken to Renee Dalton yet? I have. She said, she asked for a full log. I sent her the audio, the manifest screenshots, the chat logs, everything. She's on a call with legal now. Good. He tapped his earpiece once more. Oh, Nora. Still with you, came her voice. Inform Renee we're moving to termination protocol. I'll give the verbal confirmation in 10. Understood. Compliance has the green light. Ellis stood again, slowly, fully. He looked over the cabin. I know some of you came here expecting a smooth, quiet flight, he said. What you got instead was a lesson one that's been ignored in too many cabins, too many waiting lounges, too many boardrooms. He didn't pace. He didn't perform. He just existed fully in that moment. Bias thrives in silence, in unchecked moments, in minor decisions made behind curtains. He looked toward the curtain that still hung over the galley. But not today. There were no more questions, no more challenges, only eyes that were wider than before. He sat again, calmly, behind him. The pilot's voice came on over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. There will be a brief delay while we complete a crew transition. Passenger safety and integrity remain our top priority at Solera Jetworks. Thank you. A voice from the back muttered, It's about time someone meant that. And Ellis, still in seat 1A, closed his eyes for just a second. Not to rest, but to remember, because the next part was just beginning. Brent Delaney sat in the galley with his elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The applause outside had stopped, but the weight of it lingered in the air, thicker than cabin pressure. He could hear the quiet murmurs from the passengers. He could hear footsteps from the tarmac. And worse, he could hear his own heartbeat, pounding like a second clock reminding him how fast everything was unraveling. He'd never seen a flight go this far off script. He hadn't thought it would matter. Not this much. Not this fast. Jillian sat across from him, her eyes vacant, locked on a fixed point somewhere past the jump seat in front of her. Her uniform was still perfectly pressed, but everything else about her had collapsed. "You don't come back from this," she whispered. Brent didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew she was right. Outside the curtain, Ellis Monroe remained seated in 1A. He wasn't leaning back. He wasn't checking his phone. He was just watching, focused, composed, the kind of stillness that made people listen, even when he didn't speak. Captain Ray Holloway returned to the cabin a few minutes later, quietly passing through to check in with Ellis. "They'll be removed in 10, the captain said under his breath. "Legal wants verbal confirmation from you before we finalize protocol." Ellis gave a single nod. "They'll get it." Across from him, Lena Park was scrolling through the ethics submission portal on her device, tagging files, organizing uploads, categorizing timestamps. Her hands were steady, efficient. It no longer looked like an intern doing her best. It looked like someone ready to lead. Then, something unexpected happened. Brent pulled back the galley curtain himself and stepped into the aisle. He didn't look defiant. He didn't look angry. He looked wrecked. He walked slowly toward the front of the cabin, where every eye turned toward him, unsure whether to brace or listen. When he stopped near Ellis's row, he spoke before anyone could question him. "I need to say something," he said, "before I lose the nerve." Ellis didn't speak. Neither did Camila or Arav or David. Brent took a breath, eyes darting toward Lena, then back to the others. "This wasn't random," he said, voice low but firm. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a one-time incident." Passengers leaned in slightly, breath held. "We've been coached," Brent admitted, not officially, not written down, but everyone knew. He swallowed hard. "We were told to maintain the look of first class, make the cabin feel premium. You know what that means when you've worked enough flights." "Say it," Lena said softly. Brent hesitated. Then he did. "It means fewer passengers who look like you," he said, eyes flicking to Ellis. "Or like her," he added, gesturing to Lena. "Or like him," nodding toward Arav. Gas echoed through the rows. Camilla leaned forward. "You're admitting there was a policy." "Nova," Brent said quickly. "That's the thing. There was never a formal policy. That's what made it work. It was all quiet, all implied. Every new flight attendant figures it out eventually." He looked down, ashamed. "You keep your job by blending in, by not asking questions." David stood again. "So how many people have you done this to?" Brent's face tightened. "Too many. We kept a log. Not official. Just a way to track who we bumped, who we moved. We called it seat smoothing. A list of people who didn't fit the profile. And most of them were," Camilla asked. Brent's voice cracked. "Black, brown, foreign-sounding names. Sometimes just someone wearing the wrong kind of clothes. Silence fell again, heavier than before. Ellis didn't look surprised. He just looked tired. "I knew," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how deep it ran." Brent nodded slowly. "I wasn't always like this. I started out wanting to be the one who changed things. But the system," he shook his head, "it's like it pulls you in, makes you choose between your paycheck and your principles. And you chose the paycheck," Lena said. Brent didn't argue. "I did." Arav exhaled sharply. "And now you want a clean conscience because you got caught." "No." Brent said, "I want to say it out loud because I should have said it years ago." Ellis sat forward. "Where's the list?" Brent reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, tattered edges, coffee-stained cover. He handed it to Lena. "I kept it because part of me knew one day someone would ask." She opened the notebook and scanned a few pages. Names, dates, seat changes, scribbled notes. She closed it and tucked it into her blazer. "This will go to internal audit," she said. Brent nodded. "Good." Jillian stepped out of the galley now, too, her eyes red but dry. "We weren't trained to be this way," she said quietly, "but we were trained in silence. No one told us to do it. No one had to. It was in the looks, the nods, the unspoken orders. You still made the choice," Ellis said. She didn't argue. "You're right." Captain Holloway returned from the front of the cabin. "Ground security is ready," he said to Ellis. "Do you want to proceed?" Ellis stood slowly. "Yes," he said. "I do." He turned to Brent and Jillian. "You're being terminated not just for misconduct, but for moral failure, for compromising the dignity of the people you were supposed to protect." He looked at Jillian. "You said I didn't belong here, but I've spent my life building spaces for people like me to finally belong." Then he turned to the cabin. "I'm Ellis Monroe, and from this day forward, Solara Jetworks will be known not just for how we fly, but for how we treat the people on board. Everyone." The door to the jet bridge opened. 2 members of Solara ground security stepped onto the aircraft. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Jillian walked toward them first, her steps slow, her shoulders slumped. Brent followed, not looking back. As they disappeared through the door, the silence in the cabin wasn't celebratory. It was heavy with reckoning, Camilla whispered. That was the sound of accountability. Lena nodded, then looked at Ellis. "What happens now?" she asked. Ellis turned to her. "Now we rebuild. Properly." And with that, he sat back down in seat 1A. This time, with the whole world watching, the cabin was still in the aftermath. Not chaos, something quieter, something heavier. The kind of hush that follows a truth no one can unhear. Ellis Monroe sat back in seat 1A, not as a passenger anymore, not even as a CEO. In that moment, he was simply a man sitting inside the consequence of his own calm resistance. Across the aisle, Lena Park hadn't moved. The little notebook Brent had handed her sat on her lap like a piece of evidence too hot to touch. Her fingers hovered over it, not out of fear, but reverence. Inside were names, dozens, passengers bumped without explanation, passengers whose skin tone, last name, or clothing choice made them not quite the right look for first class. And Lena knew she had once almost been one of them, if Jillian hadn't hesitated, if Ellis hadn't spoken up, if that video hadn't been recorded. Her career would have started with silence. Instead, it would start with a voice. The intercom crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Holloway said, his voice measured but softer now, We thank you again for your continued patience. We are preparing for final boarding compliance and new crew onboarding. We'll update you shortly. Click. Ellis looked to Lena and nodded once. Would you walk with me? He asked. Lena blinked in surprise. Me, yes. Bring the notebook. Passengers turned to watch as Ellis rose and walked with Lena toward the front. He didn't make a show of it. No long strides. No grand gestures. But every step held weight. Ray Holloway opened the cockpit door for them. Take your time, he said simply. Inside the flight deck. Ellis pulled out a small console embedded into the wall behind the captain's chair. It looked like a panel for safety manuals, but when he keyed in a short passcode, it clicked open. Inside was a secure black tablet marked with Solera's emblem. He powered it up. You're about to upload the list, Lena asked. Ellis nodded. To the internal justice system we built after the Ryan Caldwell incident last year. I remember, she said quietly. He was removed from a flight for asking why his seat was switched. He never raised his voice, Ellis said, but he was black, and he was firm. That was enough. He handed Lena the tablet. I want you to be the one to upload it. Her eyes widened. Sir, are you sure, Lena? He said gently. You stood when no one else did. You believed your instinct, and you acted on it. That's leadership. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the device. She opened the log, scanned it once more, then tapped Upload. The screen flashed green. Success. Report. Submitted to executive compliance. Ellis reached for his earpiece. Nora, still with you, came her voice. Send the alert out to the board. Flag the Brent Delaney list as confirmed. I want compliance officers in every hub tonight. Already on it, Nora replied. Also, Lena Park just submitted the upload, and her name's been flagged for internal leadership tracking. You want to tag it? Ellis smiled. Yes, priority status. She doesn't know it yet, but I'm fast-tracking her to ethics oversight if she wants it. Lena's head snapped up. Wait what you heard me, Ellis said. Calm. We don't just remove the broken parts. We promote the ones who know how to repair. Lena didn't cry. Not yet. But her throat closed the way it does right before the first tear finds its reason. Back in the cabin, murmurs began to rise again. Passengers checking the time. Passengers talking about the viral video. Someone quietly said, I think this is the flight from the headline. The CEO who fired the crew mid-air. But they didn't know yet what mattered more. It wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuild. Ellis and Lena stepped back into the main cabin. Everyone looked up. Ellis gave a nod to Captain Holloway, who gave a thumbs up from the cockpit. Minutes later, a new flight attendant crew boarded 2 women, 1 man, diverse, polished, calm. They moved with quiet dignity, making eye contact with each row, offering soft greetings, Camilla whispered. Feels like a new flight, Arav said. Feels like a new airline. Lena took her seat now not just next to Ellis, but beside the truth. Passengers looked toward her with something like recognition and respect. David leaned toward her across the aisle. That thing you did, turning it in, uploading it. She smiled softly. It wasn't brave. It was necessary. Ellis looked out the window. The sun was lower now, gold edging the wings, the kind of light that makes everything clearer. Then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Renee Dalton. Board review confirmed. Mercer and Delaney permanently blacklisted from FAA-aligned carriers. Brent's list has initiated full investigation into 6 hubs. We will proceed with public transparency announcement tonight. He closed the message and looked up. Justice doesn't have to be loud, he said softly. "It just has to be true." Lena turned to him. "Are you afraid of the backlash?" Ellis shrugged lightly. "They'll say I made it about race. Didn't they already?" "They did," he said, "but I didn't. The system did. I just lit the hallway." And then something shifted again. A small girl, maybe 9 or 10, stood from seat 7C and walked forward, her father reaching for her hand but letting go when he saw her determination. She approached Ellis and held out a card. It was homemade, folded from notebook paper, crayon-drawn logo that vaguely resembled the Solara bird. He opened it. Inside it read, "Thank you for making space for people who look like me." Amira Ellis folded it gently. "Thank you, Amira," he said. She smiled and returned to her seat. Nobody clapped. They didn't need to. Some truths are better held in silence. The aircraft hadn't moved, but the world outside had. Ellis Monroe's name was now trending across social media in 3 countries. Hashtags were colliding. CEO on board. First-class bias. The Ellis effect. And yet, inside the cabin, everything remained still. The passengers had been offered drinks, snacks, even fresh blankets from the new crew. But nobody cared about the refreshments anymore. They cared about what was unfolding history in real time, truth with receipts. But the tide outside wasn't entirely warm. On his tablet, Ellis watched headlines flicker in. CEO fires crew, mid-flight abuse of power or justice. Solara Jetworks PR nightmare. When corporate wokeness goes too far. Ellis Monroe weaponizes race, destroys careers in one afternoon. He stared at them without blinking. Lena glanced over. "You expected this, didn't you?" "I did," Ellis replied quietly. He didn't scroll. He didn't refresh. He simply let the weight settle. "They'll say it's political," he murmured, "that it's performative, that I'm angry." "You weren't angry," Lena said. "You were calm. Too calm, if you ask me." Ellis chuckled lightly. "That's what scares them more." Further down the cabin, a woman in business attire stood from row 11 and slowly approached. She moved with the smooth poise of someone used to influence, but the tightness around her jaw suggested something more personal. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. Ellis looked up. "Not at all. I'm Marlene Duffy," she said, "Director of Operations for Heathrow's international arrivals." Ellis nodded slowly. "I've heard your name, and now mine is going to be attached to yours, whether I like it or not," she said, not unkindly. "I have 8 UK media outlets waiting for a statement when we land." Lena watched cautiously. "I understand," Ellis said. "You're concerned about public reaction." "No," Marlene replied. "I'm concerned about what you'll do next. Because this isn't going to be a tidy investigation and a heartfelt press release. This is going to ignite something, especially if you name airports, airlines, staff." Ellis tilted his head. "You think we should protect the institutions. I think," she said carefully, "that real change requires precision, not firestorms." Lena stepped in gently. "With respect, ma'am, precision didn't protect Brent's victims, it buried them." Marlene didn't argue. She just said, "If you need support when this escalates, my office is open. I'm not your enemy." Then she walked back to her seat. Ellis leaned back. "She's not wrong, but she's not right either," Lena whispered. "If we flinch now, we become the silence we just broke." He looked at her, really looked, and in her eyes he saw something rare. Conviction without ego, resolve without vengeance. He nodded once. "Prepare a draft for the press team," he said. "Start with This was never just about a seat. Lena tapped it into her tablet, her hand steady. Then unexpectedly her voice wavered. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" she asked, her voice lower. "Fighting systems this big. Being hated by people you'll never even meet. Being called a villain for doing the right thing." Ellis paused. Then he replied with a story. "My mother was a cafeteria worker," he said. 40 years. Wore the same shoes every day 'cause she put me through school. One afternoon, her supervisor accused her of stealing leftover food. She cried the entire night. Not because she stole, she hadn't, but because no one believed her. Lena's breath hitched. "I told myself," he continued, "if I ever got into a position of power, I'd use it to make sure people like her didn't have to beg for dignity." He looked at her. "So yes, sometimes it feels like too much. But it's not about whether it's worth it. It's about whether I'm still the man she raised." Lena blinked back emotion. "You are," she whispered. From behind them, Camilla leaned over again. "They just released a statement," she said, "from Solara's main office." Ellis pulled up the feed. "Solara Jetworks stands by the decision of our CEO, Mr. Ellis Monroe. We believe dignity is non-negotiable. We are conducting a full audit across all flight crews, effective immediately." Arav let out a low whistle. "That's bolder than I expected." "Renee Dalton wrote that," Ellis murmured. "She knows what's coming." Lena added, "It's going to cost them." Ellis nodded. "Good." Passengers began discussing openly now. Voices rose not in chaos, but clarity. "I always wondered why I never got those upgrades." A man in row 8 said, "They always made me wait to board, even with a first-class ticket." A woman in row 10 added. David stood and turned slightly to face others. "Now imagine that happening every day. Multiply that by years." It became a kind of quiet reckoning. People weren't just hearing about bias. They were realizing they'd lived through it, and some had benefited from it, not on purpose, but in silence. Ellis stood and walked back down the aisle slowly. As he passed each row, passengers nodded. Some reached out to shake his hand. He reached row 13 and paused. An elderly white gentleman, perhaps in his late 70s, met his eyes. "I judged you the moment you walked on," he said plainly. "Assumed you were out of place." Ellis didn't flinch. The man continued. "I was wrong. Thank you for staying in your seat." Ellis nodded once. "Thank you for saying that." By the time he returned to 1A, the mood on the aircraft had shifted again. Not celebratory, not somber, but awake. Lena looked at him. "When we land, what do you want the world to know?" Ellis considered the question for a long moment. Then he said, "That silence may feel safe, but it has a cost. And today," he exhaled, "we stopped paying it." The wheels touched down at Heathrow with a weight far beyond metal and speed. It wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something no one could quite name yet, but everyone on board felt it. The seatbelt signs blinked off, but no one moved. Ellis Monroe remained seated in 1A, his breathing steady, his eyes watching the gate bridge extend to meet the aircraft. His phone buzzed, quietly but insistently, over a dozen unread messages, a rapid pulse of red on his screen. Lena Park, seated beside him now. Swallowed hard. "Are you ready, No?" Ellis replied honestly. "But I'm certain—" There was a brief silence. Then the forward cabin door opened with a sharp hiss. 2 ground agents entered first, followed by a woman with a press badge clipped to her blazer. She scanned the cabin with a practiced eye, then met Ellis's gaze. A beat, a silent question. A nod. He stood. Passengers didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply watched, a collective awareness passing between them. The door to the jet bridge opened fully now, and outside, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters, dozens of them, crowded the enclosed walkway. Words echoed inside the cabin. "Mr. Monroe, is it true? You dismissed the entire crew mid-flight, Ellis? Do you believe Solara Jetworks can survive this backlash? Was this racially motivated? Do you regret anything?" Ellis paused at the threshold, looked over his shoulder at Lena, then turned to face the media. He didn't raise his voice, but the silence that followed his presence made microphones dip, voices hush, and shutters freeze mid-click. "My name is Ellis Monroe," he said, his voice calm and deliberate. "And today I made a decision I will never regret." The air shifted. He took a slow step forward, not because it was easy, but because it was overdue. He looked directly into the nearest camera. This flight represented more than travel. It represented access, dignity, and the quiet privileges people assume others don't notice. But we do. And this time, we responded. One reporter shouted, "Are you saying the crew is discriminatory? I'm saying the system is," Ellis said plainly. "And the crew acted in line with that system? That's the problem. And that's what we're changing." Cameras flashed again. Lena, still inside the cabin, listened with her hands folded. Her chest was tight not from fear, but from the sheer pressure of history moving forward. "Outside," Ellis continued, "to the employees who have endured years of bias and silence, today is for you. To the passengers who were told they didn't belong, today is for you. And to the voices who warned me not to speak, this silence ends now." A murmur ran through the reporters. He didn't storm off. He didn't offer a dramatic mic drop. He simply stepped aside. Lena stood, notebook in hand, and exited behind him. A young woman from a digital press outlet rushed toward her. "Are you the one who reported the list?" Lena froze. She glanced toward Ellis. He gave no signal, just met her eyes and let the moment be hers. Lena turned to the camera. "My name is Lena Park," she said. "I was in training to become flight crew for Solara. I saw something wrong, and I chose not to look away." The reporter blinked, surprised by the clarity. "And what would you say to people who think this was an overreaction?" Lena thought for a long moment. Then she said, "If truth makes you uncomfortable, maybe the lie worked too well." The crowd hushed again. She handed the reporter the copy of the Brent Delaney log, the one notated with evidence, cross-references, testimonies, the one she and Ellis had reviewed at 30,000 feet, and then she walked away, inside the terminal. Ellis and Lena were escorted by security to a quiet side lounge, away from the chaos. A screen inside already displayed the news ticker, "Solara CEO issues direct statement on mid-flight crew termination. FAA to investigate. Industry-wide bias." A glass of water sat untouched on the table. Ellis finally sat. Lena paced, her breath uneven now. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the gravity was settling in. "What happens next?" she asked. Ellis looked at her. "What do you want to happen next?" he asked instead. Lena hesitated. "I want this to matter. I want people to remember. I want change that sticks. Then you'll need to carry it," Ellis said. "Even when they stop clapping. Even when they try to twist the story. That's the part they don't teach you in crisis management. Change isn't a headline. It's the part that comes after the cameras leave." She nodded slowly. Just then, his phone lit up again. A message from NORA FAA requesting immediate access to Brent's list. CNN requesting primetime interview. Airport unions want to meet tomorrow. He sighed and stood. Tell Nora to arrange the interview, he said, but not as a debate. It's a conversation. I'm not defending a moment, I'm explaining a movement. Lena looked up. You're not afraid of losing your position? He shook his head. You don't lose what you're willing to risk for something better. There was a knock at the door. Camilla stepped in, holding her phone. You both need to see this, she said. She turned the screen. A young black boy, maybe 12, had posted a video online. He was sitting in his living room, holding a homemade sign. I want to be a pilot. Today, someone like me reminded the world that we belong in the sky too. The video already had over 1 million views. Ellis exhaled slowly. His chest rose and fell. That, he said, is why we do this. Lena sat beside him, shoulders trembling just a little, but her voice was steady. You started something. No, Ellis replied. We did. Outside, the world was still spinning, opinions forming, articles publishing, stocks fluctuating. But inside that quiet lounge, something stronger than outrage had taken root. Purpose. They didn't need to raise fists. They didn't need to break walls. They had cracked the silence. And that, sometimes, was louder than anything. 3 days had passed since Flight 308 landed. But it hadn't really landed. Not in the lives of those who were on it. Not in the inboxes, news feeds, boardrooms, or break rooms still echoing with conversations sparked midair. Ellis Monroe stood by the tall windows of his office, overlooking the runway at Solara's private hangar in New Jersey. Planes taxied in the distance, white fuselages gleaming under the afternoon sun. But for once, he wasn't thinking about aircraft. He was thinking about silence, the kind that had once been his shield, the kind he had finally broken. Behind him, Lena Park placed a folder on his desk. The audit is done, she said quietly. 72 reported incidents confirmed, 35 crew members removed, 4 regional heads under review. Ellis didn't move. People are calling it the Monroe Standard, she added. He turned slightly, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. I didn't want my name on a scandal. It's not a scandal, Lena replied. It's a shift. He looked at her. Really looked. Lena wasn't just the intern anymore. She was the woman who had risked her future to do what was right and in doing so, had found it. Have you decided? He asked. She nodded. I'm staying. Not as crew. I want to build policy, training, oversight. He walked to his desk, picked up the folder she'd left, opened it. Inside, her draft proposal, the Sky Initiative Equity in the Air. Sky? He asked. She looked out toward the tarmac. The little boy from the video, the one who wanted to be a pilot. That was his name, I figured. He should be part of the future we're building. Ellis placed the folder down and extended his hand. Lena shook it, steady and sure. In the days since the flight, the board had met twice. At the first meeting, they were scared of backlash, of stock volatility, of wokeness fatigue. But Ellis had stood before them, not as a CEO begging for reputation management, but as a man unwilling to lead a company that confused silence with safety. He had presented data, testimonies, the full Brent Delaney dossier. And then he showed them something else. A letter, handwritten in black ink, from a retired flight attendant named Diane Summers. She had been on the very first Solara JetWorks training team. She wrote, I was silent when Brent mocked a black mother who boarded with her child. I was silent when he made jokes about foreign names. And now, in my final year of life, I want you to know silence didn't protect me. It only made me smaller. Thank you for not doing what I did." After reading that letter aloud, the board voted unanimously to implement the Sky Initiative across all international routes. Change, Ellis knew, didn't always start with a roar. Sometimes it started with a seat no one wanted to give up, and a man who chose not to move. His phone buzzed again. A message from Nora Media Request from Harvard School of Business. They want to study your decision-making process as a case model. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the far wall where a large black and white photograph hung his mother, in her cafeteria uniform, smiling through tired eyes. Almost there. "Ma," he whispered. Later that evening, he and Lena attended a small gathering at the Solara Youth Aviation Center, a program Ellis had funded quietly over the years. Dozens of children, black, brown, white, and everything in between, stood around simulator stations, laughing, learning, lifting each other up. Sky was there too, shy at first, but grinning when Lena introduced him to Ellis. "You said I belong in the sky," Sky said, holding up a toy airplane. "Does that mean I can be a captain one day?" Ellis knelt down, eye level. "No," he said. Sky's face fell. Ellis smiled. "It means you already are." The crowd around them clapped, some with tears in their eyes. Cameras rolled. But for Ellis, it wasn't a performance. It was closure, the quiet kind. As the event wound down, Lena walked over, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. "To Flight 308, she said, "to the flight that never landed." Ellis replied. They clinked glasses. She looked at him, brows raised. "So, what now?" "Now," he echoed, "we keep flying. But this time, we check who's being asked to sit in the back, and we don't wait until the seatbelt sign goes off to do something about it." She nodded, and for the first time in a long while, Ellis felt something different than resolve. He felt peace. Not because the fight was over, it wasn't, but because he finally understood something his mother used to say. You don't need to raise your voice when the truth already echoes. That night, as he sat alone in his car outside his home, a final message came through on his phone, from an unknown number. No name, just a line. "Thank you. I saw you stand when they expected you to stay quiet. It gave me courage to do the same." Ellis closed his eyes and smiled. What does it mean to belong for Ellis Monroe? It wasn't about money, titles, or tailored suits. It was about something much deeper, the right to exist without apology. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He simply stood his ground and let the truth rise higher than the plane itself. This wasn't just one man's story. It was a mirror. To the moments we stay silent, to the systems we overlook, to the dignity we all deserve. And while the flight landed hours ago, the impact is still traveling, through policies rewritten, through children who now believe the sky has space for them too, and through people like you who refuse to scroll past injustice. So what will you do the next time someone's seat is reassigned? Will you look away, or will you stand quietly, powerfully, and make it known? This sky belongs to all of us. If this story touched your heart, let it touch someone else's too. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak truth softly, but unmistakably. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, keep your seat. You've earned it.